Hello, welcome to the third installment in our series. Today, we're looking at Caste of Mind, Colonialism and the Making of Modern India by Nicholas Turks, published in 2001 by Princeton University Press. The author, who is an academic and the former chancellor of the University of California, has studied at length India, both in real-life settings and in the archives. This book, Caste of Mind, is one of his numerous detailed studies, which goes against the grain of classical Indology. His approach is deconstructionist and informed by the archive of colonial India as well as by its silences. His main argument is this: the notion of caste in its current circulatory mode is a production of colonial knowledge as well as missionary enterprise. He traces the colonial enterprise obsession with ethnography, with charting, categorizing, filing away people, in order to deal with the complexity of a world which overwhelmed them. The ultimate purpose of this obsession with surveys, descriptions, and categorizations of hundreds of regional and intra-regional variations of group dynamics was to establish control and domination through administrative ethnography and the enforcement of colonial directorate. This book will address the question by suggesting that caste as we know it today is not in fact some unchanged survival of ancient India, not some single system that reflects a core civilizational value, not a basic expression of Indian tradition. Rather, I will argue that caste, again as we know it today, is a modern phenomenon, that it is specifically the product of a historical encounter between India and Western colonial rule. By this, I do not mean to imply that it was simply invented by the too clever British, now credited with so many imperial patents, that what began as colonial critique has turned into another form of imperial adulation. But I am suggesting that it was under the British that caste became a single term capable of expressing, organizing, and above all systematizing India's diverse forms of social identity, community, and organization. This was achieved through an identifiable, if contested, ideological canon as the result of a concrete encounter with colonial modernity during 200 years of British domination. In short, colonialism made caste what it is today. It produced the conditions that made possible the opening lines of this book by making caste the central symbol of Indian society. In the pages that follow, I will trace the career of caste from the medieval kingdoms of southern India to the textual traces of early colonial archives, from the commentaries of an 18th century Jesuit missionary to the enumerative obsessions of the late 19th century census, from the ethnographic writings of colonial administrators and missionaries to those of 20th century Indian scholars. I will focus on early colonial efforts to know India well enough to rule it and profit by it, as they brought together the many strands of scientific curiosity, missionary frustration, Orientalist fascination, and administrative concerns with property and taxation in the service of, among other things, colonial governmentality. I will follow these conjectural imperatives as they increasingly substituted statistical and ethnographic techniques for historical and textual knowledge, as they drew from an ample inheritance of Orientalist generalization to articulate the justifications for permanent colonial rule, and as they took on the racialized languages and conceits of late 19th century imperial world systems. And I will illustrate some of the ways in which this history provided the frame for an alternative history of social reform and nationalist resistance, which worked to throw out colonialism while absorbing from colonial encounters many of the terms and arguments of self-determination and self-government. What follows is principally about the colonial role in the historical construction of caste. I argue that the history in which caste has been constituted as the principal modality of Indian society draws as much from the role of British Orientalists, administrators, and missionaries as it does from Indian reformers, social thinkers, and political actors. Indeed, my argument is about the power of the colonial Leviathan to produce caste as the measure of all things, a feat that could have not have been accomplished had caste not become one of the most important emblems of tradition, the not-so-obscure object of desire for many Westerners and Indians alike across the full course of India's modern history. At the same time as it was a core feature of colonial power knowledge, and yet this is not a simple story of either epistemic domination or of elite collaboration. We now know that colonial conquest was not just the result of the power of superior arms, military organization, political power, or economic wealth. As important as these things were, colonialism was made possible and then sustained and strengthened as much by cultural technologies of rule as it was by the more obvious and brutal modes of conquest that first established power on foreign shores. The cultural effects of colonialism have until recently been too often ignored or displaced into the inevitable logics of modernization and world capitalism. And this only because it has not been sufficiently recognized that colonialism was itself a cultural project of control. Colonial knowledge both enabled conquest and was produced by it. In certain important ways, knowledge was what colonialism was all about. Cultural forms in societies newly classified as traditional were reconstructed and transformed by this knowledge, which created new categories and oppositions between colonizers and colonized, European and Asian, modern and traditional, West and East. Through the delineation and reconstitution of systematic grammars for vernacular languages, the control of Indian territory through cartographic technologies and picturesque techniques of rule, the representation of India through the mastery and display of archaeological mementos and ritual texts, the taxing of India through the reclassification and assessment of land use, property form, and agrarian structure, and the enumeration of India through the statistical technology of the census, Britain set in motion transformations every bit as powerful as the better known consequences of military and economic imperialism. Most saliently for the argument here, British colonialism played a critical role in both the identification and the production of Indian tradition. Current debates about modernity and tradition fail to appreciate the extent to which the congeries of beliefs, customs and practices and convictions that have been designated as traditional are in fact the complicated byproduct of colonial history. Bernard Cohn has argued that the British simultaneously misrecognized and simplified things Indian, imprisoning the Indian subject into the typecast role it assigned under the name of tradition. In the conceptual scheme which the British created to understand and to act in India, they constantly followed the same logic. They reduced vastly complex codes and their associated meanings to a few metonyms. India was redefined by the British to be a place of rules and orders. Once the British had defined to their own satisfaction what they construed as Indian rules and customs, then the Indians had to conform to these constructions. Edward Said has illuminated the process through which the Orient was orientalized precisely because of the Byzantine reinforcement of colonial power and knowledge. Partha Chatterjee has called this general process the colonial rule of difference, referring thereby to the historical fact that colonialism could only justify itself if under the regime of universal history it encountered the limit of alterity, the social fact that India must always be ruled because it could never be folded into a universal narrative of progress, modernity, and ultimately Europe. To the extent this complex of power and knowledge was colonial, he tells us, the forms of objectification and normalization of the colonized had to reproduce, within the framework of a universal knowledge, the truth of colonial difference. It is here that we come up against the special perversity of colonial modernity, for the traditional was produced precisely within the historical relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. The colonizer held out modernity as a promise, but at the same time made it the limiting condition of coloniality, the promise that would never be kept. The colonized could be seduced by the siren of the modern but never quite get there, mired necessarily if colonialism was to continue to legitimate itself in the traditional world. On the other side of the colonial divide, the colonized, sometimes in direct reaction to the colonial lie of universality, would appropriate tradition as resistance and as refuge. But under conditions of colonial modernity, tradition was simultaneously devalued and transformed. As a result, tradition too suffered from loss, even as it was tainted by its evident historicity. In the case of caste, many Indian social reformers and critics mistook this history as linear decline, the degradation of a noble system into a corrupt structure of power and dominant interest. Until the emergence of British colonial rule in southern India and by implication India at large, the crown was not so hollow as it has generally been made out to be. Kings were not inferior to Brahmins, the political domain was not encompassed by a religious domain. State forms, while not fully assimilated to Western categories of the state, were powerful components in Indian civilization. Indian society, indeed caste itself, was shaped by political struggles and processes. The vital world of political action and community was in fact overtaken by colonial rule, and public life became increasingly defined as Western, at the same time that the promise of universal modernity became more and more marked in national and racial terms. Meanwhile, public life was emptied of all traditional components, as all forms of politics were condemned as feudal and all forms of associations rendered atavistic. The permanent zamindari settlements of Bengal and Madras and the intractable histories leading to indirect rule of one form or another in one-third of India, leaving the princely states intact, produced a hollow simulacrum of India's ancient politics. The British maintained in style these kingdoms which had facilitated colonial conquests as lavish museums of old India. At the same time, these states were constant reminders of the justifications of British rule. India had been unable to rule itself because its political system was commanded by grand but quarreling kings who would shamelessly exploit their subjects in order to accumulate unlimited wealth and prestige, and had neither attended to basic principles of justice nor concerned themselves with the formation of organized administration and stable centralized power. Thus, Britain sustained the fiction that it had walked into a vacuum and had conquered India, as the Cambridge imperial historian John Seeley said, in a fit of absence of mind, after which the British ruled India for the sake of its own subjects rather than for any gain of their own. This astonishing failure of historical consciousness was of course justified through the attribution of a lack of history, and caste was taken as a sign thereof. In this environment, recognition of the power of the West became the basis both for what has been called colonial mimicry, in areas ranging from political theory to cultural production, and for the development of forms of resistance that were justified by the glorious past record of India's civilizational achievement. A new vision followed, what by now was an authoritative Orientalist script co-authored in many cases by those who accorded no particular prestige to political authority, celebrated the civilizational and spiritual achievements of old India. This vision did not address the political history of recent times. A conspicuous silence was maintained around the material basis of the vision's conditions of possibility. In thinking about the efflorescence of current debate around the subject of tradition, it is accordingly necessary to call again for the recuperation of that part of Indian traditional history that has been compromised by the vain pomp, circumstance, and exploitation of colonial feudalism. Not to argue, but rather to counter the otherworldliness of colonial fictions about history. It is time again to tell sad stories of the death of kings, how some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts, all murdered, by the ghosts of others, all murdered.